My father didn't just dismiss me. He humiliated me in front of everyone. His words cut like steel. She'll never understand what real war means. The room went silent, my chest burned, and I realized in that moment that to him, I had never been enough. My name is Antonia Caldwell, and this is the story of how that silence finally broke. The Veterans Hall smelled faintly of burnt coffee and floor wax, its wooden floor creaking under the shuffle of boots and folding chairs. Flags drooped from brass poles at each side of the stage, their fabric heavy with time. I slipped in quietly, choosing a chair in the back, hoping to disappear into the hum of low conversations and the clatter of metal legs scraping across the floor. Up front, my father moved through the crowd like he owned the room. Men in worn caps clasped his hand. Women touched his elbow as if he carried good luck in his sleeve. His shoulders squared the way they always had, his voice already louder than it needed to be, filling the space like a drumbeat. Without waiting for the program to start, he reached for the microphone. The murmur died instantly. He cleared his throat, his eyes scanning the crowd but never landing on me. His words came out sharp, each syllable clipped and deliberate. My daughter was never strong enough to understand what real war means. The sentence fell heavy, and for a moment, even the ceiling fans seemed to pause. Heat flushed my face as heads shifted and eyes turned away, choosing to stare at the flag instead of me. I stayed still, my hands clenched in my lap, forcing myself not to flinch. He laid his hand on the shoulder of the young Navy SEAL standing beside him, Remy Hayes, brought in as the night's guest of honor. "Now here!" my father boomed. "This is a true warrior!" Remy stiffened under the weight of that praise. His gaze flicked toward me, lingering just long enough to betray something unsettled. No one else caught it. Not yet. I didn't move, but inside, the storm broke wide open. It wasn't the first time he had cut me down, but it was the first time he carved me apart in front of a whole town. The house I grew up in gleamed like a barracks. Boots lined the back door in perfect formation, soles facing outward, laces tucked tight. Every Sunday. My father polished the glass case of medals until it reflected his face back at him like a mirror. Even the living room had its own rank structure, 2 chairs for guests, and 1 for him alone, marked by the square of sunlight that landed there each afternoon, as if the carpet itself wore an insignia. When I was 8, discipline came before affection. My knees buckled as I stood at attention, eyes locked forward until the muscles in my neck ached. If I blinked, his fingers tilted my chin back into place. "Again," he'd say, flat and final, until my body obeyed. No praise ever followed, only a curt nod, as though perfection was the bare minimum. My mother was the quiet counterbalance. She slipped folded scraps of paper into my lunch bag, lines of poetry written in her looping hand. Not all storms are meant to be outrun. When his voice thundered through the kitchen, hers steadied me, palms circling my back as she whispered, "Some storms you're meant to stand inside." But her gentleness couldn't erase the sharp edges of his words. More than once, he looked at me with the disappointment of a verdict and said, "If you'd been a boy, I wouldn't be let down like this." Those sentences didn't bruise skin, but they bruised something deeper. I grew up in a spotless house where every surface shone. Yet inside, I carried the dust of never being enough. The glass case reflected his glory. It never reflected me. By 17, I dared to voice what I wanted. I told him I would apply to the Naval Academy. He lowered his newspaper, folding it with surgical precision, and delivered the cut in one line. "You don't have the Constitution." I didn't know if he meant the stamina or the law, but either way, the message was clear. I wasn't fit. So I trained in the quiet hours when the house slept. I filled out forms by lamplight, tucking the envelope beneath a stack of books, until the day it carried my future out the door. When the letter of acceptance finally arrived, I held it to my chest, my pulse hammering louder than his boots ever had. My mother hugged me tight, her breath warm against my ear as she slipped 3 small envelopes into my pocket. "Open when you're lonely. Open when you're hurt. open when you forget who you are. My father, standing on the porch, didn't look up from the car he was checking. Change the oil on time, was all he said. The academy stripped me down to raw edges, then built me back into steel. I ran until my lungs tasted of blood and salt air. I filled notebooks with hand-drawn maps, layered plans on top of plans, learned the value of repetition until precision felt like prayer. Discipline was survival, but humanity, that I carried from my mother. It was there I met Remy Hayes, young and overeager, his words tumbling too fast in briefings, his chest heaving after every swim. One morning, I stopped him mid-sentence and said, "Say it again, the boring part. That's the part that saves lives." He blinked, surprised, then nodded. For the first time, his eyes held no doubt, only trust. I knew then the path I'd chosen would never earn my father's respect, but it was shaping me into the kind of person I could finally respect myself for being. The desert air pressed down like a furnace, the stench of diesel drifting from the convoy outside. Inside the makeshift operations room, I leaned over a table scarred by years of use. A map spread flat beneath my palms. Pencil lines crisscrossed the paper, the graphite smeared dark where sweat had fallen. Every inch mattered: supply routes, fallback points, batteries tucked into packs, water rationed with precision. The boring details, as some like to call them, were the very bones that kept a plan alive. One young soldier, restless with fatigue, doodled an hourglass in the corner of my map and said half-jokingly, "She's our angel." A ripple of laughter passed around the room, but the word clung to the air longer than the laughter did. That night, the plan I had prepared in silence shifted the course of everything. We moved 2 days earlier than expected, slipping past an ambush set to detonate beneath the midday sun. I watched from the dim glow of the operation screen as the phone in a bomber's hand stayed lifeless, its signal strangled by interference. The men came back breathing, boots heavy with dust but alive. There was no celebration. I marked the map with a blunt cross, exhaling as though I'd just sidestepped an execution. Weeks later, I mailed a photo home, my uniform stiff with starch, bars glinting faintly. The envelope returned unopened. My father had folded the picture in half, the crease slicing through my face. To him, my maps meant nothing, but to the men who walked through the fire and returned, they were the difference between graves and birthdays. The night split open with gunfire. The air smelled of gunpowder and fear as radios hissed with clipped commands. I'd miscalculated, just seconds off, but seconds were enough. A young soldier didn't make it back. His absence filled the room, heavier than any explosion. Afterward, I sat on my hands until the tremor in my fingers dulled. Hill, a commander weathered by too many campaigns, set a bottle of water in front of me. He said nothing, just nodded once before turning away. That silence told me he'd seen me hold steady when everything else fractured. Remy was there too. He had been spared by one of the contingency routes I'd sketched. From that night on, before leaving the room, he tapped the table twice with his knuckles. The sound was soft, but it carried weight. "We trust you." I tried to share that burden with my father. I wrote pages about the mission, about the boy we'd lost, about how the silence afterward pressed on my chest. Weeks later, the envelope came back, seal unbroken, stamped with a cold rectangle. Return to sender. That's when the meaning of silence split in two for me. From him, it was a chain. From my brothers in arms, it was faith. I learned to live in both kinds of quiet. One caged me. The other kept me upright. When I stepped back into the house, the air was heavy with the sour trace of antiseptic and wilted chrysanthemums. Death had seeped into every corner, but the glass case of medals still gleamed as if untouched by grief, polished like always, indifferent to absence. The funeral drew neighbors and veterans from town, faces I had known since childhood. They filled the pews with casseroles waiting in their cars, words of habit on their lips. My father stood rigid beside the coffin, chest squared, voice booming with the authority of a man used to commanding attention. Over and over, He told the story of the storm that had toppled the maple in our yard, but left the flag standing proud. He spun the memory as if it were his alone, as though even this day belonged to him. When it was my turn to speak, I reached for my mother's memory the only way I knew how. I spoke of her poems folded into my lunch bag, of the way she made the kitchen feel larger than its walls, always with space for one more chair. A few eyes softened, a few heads dipped, but most gazes drifted back to him, as if my words were a pause between his stories. I heard the whispers as I stepped down. Not Lieutenant Caldwell, not even my name, just, Frank Caldwell's daughter came back for the service. The sting cut deeper than I expected. To be erased in the very room where my mother's love should have anchored me felt like the sharpest betrayal. I pressed my hand against the coffin's cool surface and whispered so only she could hear. "I'll keep what you told me, Mama, not to run from storms, but not to let them swallow me either." Months passed before the email arrived. A cousin, kind but awkward with words, wrote that the town would be hosting the annual Veterans Celebration. She said it would mean something to my mother's old friends if I came. She promised there would be cake, familiar faces, and flags lining Main Street. At first, I nearly declined. But memory has its own pull. The smell of weak coffee, the sight of bunting in the breeze, the cadence of names read aloud. Against my better judgment, I replied yes. I told myself I would slip in quietly, take a chair in the back, and leave without speaking. A few days before the event, I stopped by the house to gather a box of belongings. From the kitchen, I overheard my father outside, his voice carrying easily across the yard. He was talking to a neighbor, pride swelling in every word. "Remy Hayes is the example," he declared, "the kind of son I never had." The sentence froze me in place. He had not only dismissed me, he had replaced me, and with the very man who had once stumbled through my training briefings, the soldier I had steadied when he nearly drowned in his own ambition. That's when I learned Remy wasn't just attending. He would be honored as the guest of the night. My chest tightened. The thought of watching my father exalt him while diminishing me again made my ribs ache. Yet beneath the ache, something stirred. A sense that the truth I'd carried from the desert, buried deep in silence, was about to claw its way into the open. I closed the suitcase, turned toward the glass case of medals gleaming in the half-light, and whispered to myself, "If he wants a performance, I'll sit in the crowd, and I'll let the truth take the stage." The Veterans Hall was packed wall to wall, the air thick with the scent of burnt coffee and the scrape of folding chairs settling into place. The American flag sagged above the stage, its fabric heavy, its edges brushing against brass poles scarred with age. I sat in the back, trying to steady my breath, knowing full well how easily this room could turn into a stage for someone else's story. My father rose before the program began, his presence filling the space as predictably as thunder before a storm. His voice boomed, every word cutting through the hum of chatter. "My daughter has never been strong enough to understand what real war means." The silence that followed was absolute. Heat rushed to my face, but I stayed rooted, nailed into my chair by shame he had forged over a lifetime. He pressed his hand firmly onto Remy Hayes' shoulder, the young Navy SEAL brought in as the night's guest. "This," he declared, "this is a true warrior." The weight of that pronouncement hung in the air, suffocating. No one moved. No one dared breathe louder than the fans groaning overhead. Then Remy shifted. His jaw tightened. His throat bobbed hard as if swallowing gravel. Slowly, his eyes found mine across the crowded hall, and in a voice that cracked the silence wide open, he asked, trembling but clear, "Ma'am, are you the angel of death?" The room erupted in whispers. A woman near the front leaned toward her neighbor and breathed, "She's somebody." In the back, an old veteran pulled off his cap and pressed it against his chest. The atmosphere shifted, the collective breath of the hall turning heavy, reverent. For the first time, my father's words no longer held the room. Remy didn't flinch when my father shifted beside him, ready to wave the moment away like smoke. Instead, he stepped forward, his voice firm, carrying across the wooden beams and rows of folding chairs. He spoke of nights when the desert air burned like a furnace, when the radios hissed with static and fear. He told them how plans sketched in pencil, my pencil, had steered them away from death. He described the contingency routes I laid out, the way I made them recite boring steps until they could breathe them in their sleep, and he reminded them that those boring steps were the reason entire squads came home. He paused, the muscles in his jaw working, and his voice dropped to something that wasn't just testimony, but confession. Some of us still have birthdays because of her. The words cracked something open. Chairs creaked as men and women leaned forward. Then one veteran rose to his feet. Another followed, then another. No applause, no cheering. Only silence, thick, reverent, unshakable. That silence held more weight than any ovation ever could. My father's shoulders stiffened. For the first time I could remember, he had no story to drown out the truth. He turned his face toward me, his practiced authority slipping, his eyes searching for footing in a room that no longer belonged to him. For decades, he had commanded spaces like this with little more than his voice. Tonight, the room had chosen not to listen. When the program ended, people clustered in hushed knots, reluctant to disturb what had just settled in their bones. I was gathering my coat when I felt his presence beside me. His voice, usually booming, came out roughened, cracked around the edges. I expected a son. That was my mistake. I looked at him, steady, letting the silence stretch before answering. Then start as a student. He blinked, as though the sentence landed heavier than he was prepared for. I didn't reach out my hand. Mercy didn't need to look like absolution. But in that moment, I gave him the smallest of doors. He could step through it if he chose, or stay outside with his medals and his silence. Either way, the room had already rewritten the story, and for once, it wasn't his voice etched into the walls. It was mine. Back at the base, life resumed in the rhythm I knew best. Maps spread across the table, smudged with pencil marks, and the edges curling from overuse. On the whiteboard behind me, a new checklist took shape, lines and bullet points that seemed tedious to anyone else, but to me were lifelines. Each detail was a safeguard, each step a promise that someone would return home to a waiting porch light. The room was quiet, except for the faint hum of the air system when the envelope arrived. My name was written in a shaky hand I recognized instantly, though it seemed smaller, less certain than I remembered. I turned it over once, then again, reluctant to open it, afraid it might be another rejection sent back sealed like so many before. But the flap had been torn open already, and inside was only a single sheet of paper. No long explanations, no elaborate stories, no thunderous voice stamped across the lines, just 4 words, penned with an unsteady hand. I should have stood sooner. I read it once, then twice, my throat tightening in ways I hadn't expected. There was no apology, no attempt to undo years of silence or the weight of disappointment. But it was something, an acknowledgement carved out of a man who had built his entire life on never-yielding ground. I pinned the letter to the corkboard above my desk, right next to the latest map of supply routes. It hung there quietly, not to erase the past, but to mark it. It wasn't closure. It wasn't reconciliation. But it was the last piece I needed to place. Proof that even the hardest voices can falter when the truth finally breaks through. I leaned back, exhaled, and let the quiet settle over me. The worth of my life was never in how quickly or slowly he rose to his feet. It was in the men who breathed because I had drawn the lines right, in the silence that honored rather than erased. The truth had stood long before he ever did, and the truth would never be denied.